Now I want to introduce one more speaker before we break, and that is the Honourable Dr Wayne Mapp. Wayne has very recently stepped down from being a minister and he's on the verge of getting his commercial pilot's licence. So if you want to talk aeroplanes, he is the man that you should talk to. Clearly he's been an MP for a long time and he served in major roles. His cabinet positions were Minister of Defence and Research, Minister of Science and Technology, and of course he has also lectured in commercial law. So Wayne, you've thought about some of these issues from different perspectives because you have had an academic career and you've also been recently on the other side as a minister, as a government side. So give us some insights as to how the parties can work together and be more effective. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mai, for that introduction. What I thought was particularly valuable about the toolbox, which I read at length over January, February, and made a few suggestions, was the way it stepped beyond the usual text. The typical legal text, for instance, on public administration and law, would give you a comprehensive guide to the details of those rules, statutory, regulatory or administrative. Best to think of those as the hardware of the system. What the toolbox does, however, is provide you the software of the system, how you would actually use those rules to interact with the system, and a number of the presentations you've heard already kind of deal with that. And what it essentially does is give you a bit of a guide as to when the formal rules are primary, but also when influence and suggestion and relationships are really more important. Now, one of the questions I had of Mai when she was writing it and sending me these chapters, I said, Mai, are you giving away your IP here? And after thinking about that question myself a bit, I thought, actually, not really. She's providing a public service by giving the wider New Zealand sort of the software. But of course, you all know, when you buy a computer, it takes a while to learn to use the hardware and the software. And you can only do that really by years of experience, by actually being involved in the engagement with government. And I suspect that's really your IP, in fact. It's those relationships you build. You know, I heard Phil say, well, you know, he's in the shorts and the t-shirt and he's at the bacon counter. Why weren't you at the healthy foods counter, is what I would say, talking to members of Parliament and ministers. And that's true to an extent, because what that tells you is that Phil knows the people. Doesn't need an introduction, just goes up and talks to them. Not quite so easy for everyone else, I'd have to say, or for a large number of people who don't actually necessarily know their member of Parliament or a minister. And it takes, and it's that access. It is true we're a small society, but we're not quite a village either. We're sort of just at the next level up, and I will sort of deal with that a bit. So what I'm going to talk about really today is my experience as a minister, how you deal with ministers. Now, this is my particular insight. It's the way I did things. Other ministers will act differently. There should be a common core of practice. The Cabinet Manual is supposed to assist in discerning best practice and probably even does so in reality. I will have to confess it did take me a little bit of time to actually get round to reading the Cabinet Manual, and I did in fact look at it a couple of times during the time I was a minister. But in truth, almost all ministers will have developed their own particular way of dealing with constituents, with lobby groups, with interest groups and others by the time they become ministers. And that style will either keep them out of trouble or in some cases actually get them into trouble. And so the way to think about this, it seems to me, is ask the question, who wants to see ministers and why do they want to see them? And there are, in my view, at least 5 specific categories. The first actually a bit like Business New Zealand and some of the NGOs, those who want to see government in a general sense to ensure that it implements its declared policy. They may have even had a role in developing it, some of it, because they have a vested interest in the outcome of that policy. Second, there are those, also often the same groups, who want to, as say, specifically develop policy where they perceive there's either gap or in fact where existing policy is in fact deficient. The third is general introductions to experts, interest groups and companies. And in my portfolio in science had a huge number of people in this particular category. And much of it, I think, they saw themselves in really as informing the minister to be able to get on, or her, to be able to get on top of the portfolio and understand the nuances within it. And just the velocity of contact really helped that. The fourth group is what I would say those who are lobbying governments on issues within their own particular expertise. Now this is different to the third category. The third category is really just an information zone. This here is where a specific group, typically an NGO actually, is wanting to deal with a minister or indeed a member of parliament generally on their specialist interest. A case of importance for me was Amnesty International, who had a particular interest in the treatment of detainees in Afghanistan. And it was important for me as a minister to hear what they had to say, to understand the detail of the concern and indeed have a response to it. Because as I say, this is an area of deep interest and expertise for them and where New Zealand's international reputation is on the line. And the final category I have is those who are wanting to sell goods and services to the government. Defence was particularly prominent in this particular area. Now fortunately in New Zealand, ministers don't directly enter into contracts, but nevertheless ministers do need to know the range of firms who are active in this area. Now I know that's not an exhaustive list. In some of those instances people would be accompanied by professional advisors. In many cases they were not. And it's not always the case that a professional advisor is even helpful. Often the role of the professional advisor was actually a little bit in the background, organising the meeting, setting up the terms of the meeting and so forth, but are not actually being present because the minister ultimately wants to hear from the people directly, not necessarily through an intermediary. Some occasions the advisor might just help steer something or correct a misapprehension, but by and large it's desirable if that doesn't occur. All of that should have occurred between the professional advisor and their client before the meeting itself, so that the minister would then have confidence in the persons or group that they are meeting. Now, if you take that general first category, it's pretty easy to deal with. As has already been said here today, members of parliament and ministers are constantly lobbied on all sorts of things. Policy, changing policy, understanding the implications of it, and so forth. And that is in fact the very essence of politics. And it doesn't raise any concerns. The reason it doesn't raise concerns is because by and large there's no issues of specific preferences being engaged. Now obviously political parties have different perspectives. National is inclined to have employment laws that will promote the interests of free markets and employers. Labour will have employment laws that are more regulated and will favour employees. And respective lobby groups are going to lobby respective parties accordingly and indeed be engaged in the development of policy in those areas. But in neither case, with either of those parties, is there ever really a question of a specific employer or indeed a specific union being favoured by that relationship. It's more of a general interest and a broader ideological perspective, if you will, of the political system, and the political system exists, of course, in a sense, to sort out the nation's preferences in those areas. And as I said, similarly with NGOs with specific mandates, and I used the example already of Amnesty, and I had a substantial dialogue with them around the whole issue of detainees, and it was important, at least from my point of view, that the Minister meet Amnesty to give what I considered was the appropriate assurances that New Zealand both understood its international obligations and fully and completely observed them. The second category, which is my fifth category, of those who are wanting to sell goods and services, on the other hand, is a little bit more problematic. The very first point a minister has to consider, and I suggest actually for professional advisors as well, is whether the meeting should take place at all. The first question you consider, because you can instantly see the issues that will arise. And it was my view, as I say, mostly in the defence area, that I needed to meet defence contractors in order to understand the range of technological opportunities that existed that would meet New Zealand's defence needs. Might be frigate mission systems, air trainer aircraft, a whole range of things. And so governments need to know who's out there, what they're offering, and so they have kind of some sort of broad sense of understanding the situation. I always ensured that there were other people present at such meetings, typically from either the NZDF or the Ministry of Defence. The more problematic area within that specific area, of course, is where there is a specific supplier lobbying for a specific contract in cases where they were the only possible supplier. And that does exist in a number of areas, but as I say, particularly unique to defence. I suspect in some IT areas it might exist as well. And I might also note that officials have much the same dilemmas as ministers when confronted with that situation. Now, you can't have a situation where there's no interaction. They are, after all, the only credible supplier in the field. So I suggest the right thing there is the appropriate levels of transparency occurring. That's not necessarily issuing a press release, but it's making sure everything's properly documented, recorded, so if there was ever a situation where that meeting would become public, that there would be never any questions of improper conduct or inappropriate preference, or indeed the minister getting directly engaged in the contract negotiation. So, sort of general information, even specific information, but never being engaged in the actual contractual negotiation or tender, which must always be left to officials. The test is this, as I said: would you be embarrassed if it became in public that you'd actually met? So this is an issue of judgment. Judgment by the minister, judgment by the business client in that particular case, and judgment by advisors as to whether or not the meeting should have taken place in the first instance. I might just close on this point. And I think actually Phil did demonstrate an important point. We are a small, open democracy. All of us value the fact that it is relatively easy, even if there isn't a personal relationship, to meet members of Parliament and ministers. Not quite so easy for ministers. There are time constraints. But it's not often that it's impossible for anyone to meet someone who's in a position of authority in a ministerial or MP capacity. And that is one of the great strengths of our democracy. It makes us a bit different to most other places that we would compare ourselves. Australia's 5 times larger, Britain 15 times larger. You can't even compare ourselves to the United States. He used President Barack Obama. It's worth remembering, however, that a congressman or woman actually represents 600,000 people. So the relationship is completely different over there, and the rules that apply there don't really apply in New Zealand. And I certainly took the role. Other than these contractual issues, basically I would meet anyone and everyone who asked for a meeting. And it mightn't take place tomorrow, but there'd always be a way. And I think by and large, New Zealanders expect that of the relationship. Openness and transparency is at the core of it, but the most important part of it is actually the availability and the access. And that is one thing that we should absolutely treasure in our system. Thank you.